What happened to the economy during the Great Depression?
I was born in the middle of the Great Depression in 1935. I don't know how our mother did it, but we had a roof over our heads, and food to eat. When World War II came, the government put us into concentration camps. Ours was in the isolated area of Northern California, and that was our home for about 3 years. After the war, we returned to Sacramento, and lived in a huge house with about 3 families. We then moved to the Buddhist church, and our home was a classroom divided by army blankets. That's where we lived for the longest time. Our family moved to a house for the first time, but I left home to pursue my senior year in Oakland. After high school, I moved to Chicago to look for another life, but that didn't work out, so I enlisted into the U.S. Air Force. The Air Force assigned me to work with nuclear weapons, so that gave me the motivation to earn my college degree after my discharge. All turned out well after that. I had 4 job offers before I graduated with my accounting degree. I chose Florsheim Shoe Company, because I would be a field auditor to travel the 7 western states to audit about 50 company stores. After 3.5 years, they promoted me to audit manager. But we had to move to Chicago. After 3 years in Chicago, I was ready to move back to Northern California to family, friends, and the climate. I worked for a couple of companies in management, but eventually started doing business consulting, and did pretty good with it. I traveled the world, and retired early. Met many interesting people during my travels. Even a rocket scientist, who helped design the aerodynamics on the atomic bombs I worked with in the Air Force. Bob Brodsky taught astronautics at USC and Iowa State University. I met him on one of my many trips. We kept in touch for many years, until he passed away a few years ago. I now have friends in Germany, France, England, Canada, Mexico, Cuba, Singapore, Bhutan, and across the US. So, the Great Depression was a temporary crisis for myself and family.
What happened to rich people's money during the Great Depression?
As prices collapsed, the value of a dollar increased. $1 could buy more goods and services. The short answer then is the rich got richer. Money symbolizes material wealth such as buildings, machines, mines, farmland, etc. All the wealth that was there before the Depression didn't disappear, it was either put on ice or changed hands. Factories shut down but were reorganized, retooled, and opened under new management later. Individual farmers lost their land but it was bought up by agribusiness. Many financial institutions went under but sold their assets, for pennies on the dollar, to larger institutions, and so on.
Did the stock market play any role during the Great Depression?
Too much speculation and lack of banking and rise of corporate entities first began. Unregulated entropy. Excessive debt levels still after World War I and a no solid monetary policy. Add to it the Dust Bowl climate event, and farmers losing and corporation took over land and banks. J.P. Morgan, and others had to bail out the government. The Federal Reserve came into being as a middleman between the banks and U.S. Treasury. The collective effect erased the value of stock. It had no inherent value but of assumed worth of currency exchange based on the gold standard matrix. I'm generalizing, but in short, the stock market was a fragile thing and not yet did government oversight (SEC) exist. Like now, a large portion of population lost buying power, income disrupting economic stability, loss of assets, and the rich got richer in the fallout. The battle against monopolies was at the peak consolidating market posture as is happening now. While this does increase efficiency of supply and demand fulfillment, it, also, centralizes wealth and decays competitive pricing and controls market superiority over any outrigger chance to compete and match pricing volume, and ability to adjust to retain it. Today, is quite different.
What were the most wealthy states during the Great Depression?
The Great Depression fluctuated a lot, and had begun in the western states in 1921 to 1922, and continued mostly while the Dust Bowl particularly impacted the Midwest, destroying assets and essentially making 3 million Americans homeless. New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois were wealthy from their past century of economic growth, major companies and banks headquartered there, lots of real estate demand, and dense markets. California was probably the new wealth leader during the Great Depression. It was the world's largest oil producer, the movie-making center. The Hearst newspaper's chain base there reached 42% of Americans every day. Oranges and orange juice were extremely popular. As were grapefruit, limes, lemons, raisins, prunes, etc. that were grown in California, Texas, or Florida mostly, and could reach distant markets in the new refrigerated railroad cars and trucks, aircraft manufacturers had clustered in California. The new electronics manufacturing firms were clustering around Stanford University already. Fish canning and commercial fishing were the Imperial Valley and the Fresno area already were producing a substantial share of America's total vegetables and fruits, and the influx of millions moving to California, Los Angeles more than doubling, drove up real estate prices and construction activity. Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas were the poorest then and for 50 years afterwards.
Which companies or individuals made a killing during the Great Depression?
House of Morgan, New Deal bureaucrats, Huey Long, John Steinbeck, Procter & Gamble, Chevrolet, Lucky Strike, newspapers in every city, radio companies.
For more stories like this, make sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Take care, and see you in the next story.